Welcome to our session on the Tribal CCDF Plan Section 1 for child count. This is for tribal lead agencies with all allocation sizes. Next slide, please. So today we want to welcome everybody, and we will start by introducing myself and my co-presenter. My name is Gabriela Alvarez. I'm the Tribal Subject Matter Expert for Quality Improvement with the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center, and I will now pass it over to Melody to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melody Redbird Post. I'm the Project Director of the Tribal Child Care Capacity Building Center. Glad to be here. Back to you, Gabriela.
Thank you. Okay, can we move on to our objective slide, please? Okay, so today what we want you all to leave with is with an understanding of the minimum requirements and flexibilities for conducting the CCDF child count, including implications for families, providers, and their communities, defining Indian child and service area. We would like you to leave with you all conferring with tribal lead agencies with neighboring and overlapping service areas and conducting the child count. We want you to leave with an understanding of what sufficient responses are for Section 1 and to gain awareness of implementation stages of the CCDF requirements. Next slide, please. So every 3 years, as part of the CCDF plan submission, all tribal agencies submit a self-certified number of Indian children under the age of 13 in their service area that will be used as the basis for CCDF funding formula for a 3-year period. The child count declaration or number is used by the ACF to calculate the amount of the grant award for each tribal lead agency on an annual basis. The children counted are based on children who meet your definition of an Indian child that reside within your self-defined service area. Next slide, please. Tribal lead agencies have flexibility to determine the methodology and data sources used for their child count. You are not required to submit your methodology or data sources with your child count, but you should document this information in your internal policies and procedures. Tribal lead agencies must confer with tribal lead agencies who are neighboring or have overlapping service areas to ensure an unduplicated count of children. The tribal lead agency's child count cannot change during the 3-year period. If a consortia has a change in membership, they must notify OCC and the child count will be updated based on such change. Next slide, please. So why the child count matters? Child counts really consist of 3 parts. The count, which is the actual number, the definitions, Indian child and service area. A child count is required by the CCDB Act every 3 years. Child count numbers are the basis for CCDF funding for your tribal lead agency. All child counts are needed to calculate the allocation for each tribal lead agency. Any issues or delays in receiving a child count can affect all tribal lead agencies. The definition of an Indian child and CCDF service area are the basis for CCDF eligibility. So now I am going to pass it over to Melody to discuss the next simple graphic.
Thank you, Gabriela. All right, so in this graphic, this is outlining how the tribal funding works with the child count. Tribal CCDF funding is a certain percentage of the overall CCDF appropriations. Tribes submit their child count, and then a formula is run and divided among tribal lead agencies' portion of the overall funding. And we'll go to the next slide and we'll kind of talk through a couple examples. So here on this slide, this is an example that uses a hypothetical even number just for the purposes of illustration. So the number we're going to look at is we're going to hypothetically say that the total CCDF tribal set-aside is set at $100 million. And then you see 2 examples of child counts. So the first row, child count submission number 1, shows 3 different tribes' child counts. So Tribe A submitted a child count of 100 children, and they were allocated a $12 million grant for CCDF. Tribe B submitted a child count of 200 children and were allocated a $25 million grant for CCDF. And then Tribe C submitted a child count of 500 children and were awarded a $62 million grant. And so you can see all of those three grant allocations add up to $100 million. So let's see what happens if the child count were to change. So let's imagine in child count submission number 2, which is that second row there, let's imagine that the next plan cycle, the same 3 tribes submit their child counts. In this example, Tribe A actually increased their child count, and so they submitted their child count totaling $400, which represents 400 children, which represents a 300% increase in child count numbers, and that results in a $36 million grant for CCDF, okay? And then you have Tribe B, and they submitted their same child count they did the previous cycle, and they got awarded actually a 28% lower allocation of 18 million for CCDF. And finally, Tribe C, they also kept the same child count at 500 children, and they got a decrease of 27% in their CCDF grant for $45 million. And so those same 3 tribes, those 3 allocations, they still add up to that hypothetical total CCDF tribal set aside of $100 million. And so you can see in this example that the resulting allocation amounts are impacted even if only one tribe changes their child count and their child count increases. So we just wanted to talk through this as an example and things to consider regarding how the child count that you submit can impact other tribal aid agencies. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So as Gabriella mentioned, there are 2 components necessary as part of the determination of the number of children within the tribe, and that is the definition of Indian child and the definition of service area. And that is definition of service area on or near the reservation, except for tribes in Alaska, California, and Oklahoma. The choices within your CCDF plan will build on these 2 definitions. So let's move on to the next slide to begin exploring the definition of Indian child. So tribal aid agencies are required to provide a definition of Indian child in their child count declaration, and children must meet this definition to receive CCDF services. Tribal aid agencies have flexibility in defining Indian child and may include children from other federally recognized tribes. There is broad flexibility regarding how tribal aid agencies choose to define Indian child. Tribal aid agencies can choose to define Indian child as a child who is an enrolled member of the federally recognized tribe. They can also choose to define Indian child more broadly as any child who has verifiable American Indian or Alaska Native ancestry as determined by either tribal enrollment, a certificate of Indian blood, or a birth certificate documenting lineal descent. The definition of Indian child can include children who are tribal members, whose membership is pending, who are eligible for membership, and who are children or descendants of members. This could also include children who do not have tribal ancestry, but who are adopted children, foster children, and stepchildren. Tribal aid agencies can also include children from other tribes in their definition of Indian child if the tribes are federally recognized. We also wanted to share that the tribe's definition of Indian child can vary from its specific tribal citizenship or enrollment criteria, but must be children from a federally recognized Indian tribe. A federally recognized Indian tribe means an Indian or Alaska Native tribe, band, nation, pueblo, village, or community which appears on the list of recognized tribes published in the Federal Register by the Secretary of the Interior. Next slide. As you begin to think through either expanding or narrowing your definition, let's review some guiding questions that might assist you in making your choices. Let's first look at expanding your definition. Do you have the data set that aligns with your expanded definition to get an accurate count? Do you have a challenge spending your current allocation? Are there Native families who currently do not meet your definition in the service area that would qualify for services? Who would you need to discuss this potential change with? Are there other children and family services in your community that have a more expansive definition? Now, let's think about narrowing your definition. Do you have a data set that aligns with a narrower definition? Are you short on funds at the end of the year? Would there be families that would no longer be eligible for services? Who would you need to discuss this potential change with? Are there other children and family services in your community that have a narrower definition? Next slide. A tribal lead agency's service area must be on or near the reservation and therefore must be within a reasonable, close geographic proximity to the delineated borders of a tribe's reservation. Tribes that do not have reservations must establish service areas within reasonably close geographic proximity to the area where the tribe's population resides. When determining a tribal lead agency service area, it's important to remember there's an expectation that the tribal lead agency will be able to provide services to families throughout the service area. It is also important to consider the area in which the CCDF eligible families reside, work, and are needing childcare. The proximity of the families to the tribally operated center, if that is the only type of care provided. The types of providers the tribal lead agency uses, for example, relative care, center-based, in-home, and family childcare available throughout the proposed service area. The capacity of the tribal lead agency to monitor all providers within the service area to ensure the health and safety of children in care. The use of state licensed providers and utilizing their monitoring practices, and the ability to support quality childcare in all provider settings throughout the service area. ACF will not approve an entire state as a tribe's service area. For example, if a service area based on close proximity is too large to adequately meet the needs of all children who are eligible for CCDF, a tribal lead agency may choose to reduce its service area size and only focus on an area where the CCDF eligible families reside and work. And another example, if a service area is based on close proximity and it does not include an area with a large population of CCDF eligible families, the tribal lead agency may choose to readjust its service area. Next slide. And here are some examples of service area for reference. The area within a 35-mile radius of the tribe's reservation boundaries, having permanent residents on or near the tribe's reservation, near meaning within a 10-mile radius of the tribe's reservation. The family's permanent residence is located within the tribe's reservation, county, or the communities directly surrounding it to include XYZ. The tribe's reservation, which includes X county and the city and state. The tribal lead agency defines the reservation service area as living on or within 60 miles of the tribe's reservation and off-reservation trust land. Next slide. As you begin to think through either narrowing or expanding your definition, let's review some guiding questions that might assist you in making your choices regarding service area. Increasing your service area, think about, do you have a data set that aligns with an expanded service area? Do other tribal lead agencies provide CCDF services in the proposed area? Are there unmet child care needs in your current service area? Do you have the funding to serve more children? For decreasing your service area, do we have access to data sets that align with a narrower definition? Are there families that would no longer be eligible for services? Would this create unmet child care needs? Next slide. So here are some tips and considerations for thinking about while you write your definitions. Regarding your Indian child definition, do not include references to the service area. Do not include references to other eligibility criteria such as an eligible activity like work, training, or education, etc. Do not include references to the age of children. For service area definition, do not include references to neighboring or overlapping service area or coordination of CCDF services. Next slide. If you have additional questions, the Office of Child Care has published some policy questions that may help you think through the development of your definitions. For example, if you have included an expansive definition of Indian child, for instance, all children enrolled in or descendants of enrolled members of federally recognized tribes, then you cannot prioritize children who are members of your tribe when determining eligibility. And that's just one example, and there are some other questions and responses here on the screen. Next slide. The definitions of Indian child and service area are the foundation for conducting your child count because they determine which children are eligible to be included in the child count. Once these definitions have been determined, the next step is to identify existing data sources that are available and submit requests for that data as needed. Your data source must align with your definitions. Tribes would then use that information to determine their unduplicated child count and work with all other tribal CCDF lead agencies who have neighboring or overlapping service areas during this process. Then the tribal lead agency should ensure they have access to the CARS system prior to the July 1st deadline and enter the number of Indian children in CARS. Once the plan is submitted and certified by your tribe's designated certifier, it is considered complete. If the tribal lead agency is a consortium, the chart must be completed with each member tribe's individual child count and attach a declaration or demonstration form or letter. The form or letter must have an official signature from an individual authorized to act for the tribe. Once complete, the information will be entered and certified within CARS. And so let's go into each of these steps more in detail. Next slide. After your definitions of Indian child and service area have been determined, the next step is to identify your data sources. There is no federal requirement regarding which data sources a tribal lead agency can use. Tribal lead agencies can use any federal, tribal, or local data to inform their child count. It is imperative that the data used to conduct the child count be both valid and reliable. A way to ensure program integrity and accountability is to document your steps, contacts, and resources in collecting the data within your internal policies and procedures. And for the next part, I'll pass it over to Gabriella.
Thank you, Melody. Okay, so next slide, please. So tribes should, I'm sorry, go back a slide. Tribes should also have written policies and procedures for conducting the child count that document the methodology being used. Methodology could include process for requesting information, data sources being used, detailed calculation steps, methods to ensure non-duplicated counts, process for tribal certification, and submission procedures. Remember, you do not have to submit your methodology to the Office of Child Care. It is good practice to have written policies and procedures as you may need it for a variety of sources. Next slide, please. Throughout the process of conducting your child count, it is important to ensure that you are not counting any child who is included in the count of another tribal agency. This is known as an unduplicated child count. To ensure unduplicated child counts, a tribal lead agency is required to confer with all other CCDF tribal lead agencies that have overlapping or neighboring service areas. The image on the screen displays how service areas can overlap. The darker shaded area shows where they all come together. Coordination is another key step to keep in mind when you are planning. If you have neighboring tribal lead agencies, or if you have an overlapping service area with another tribal lead agency, you will want to make sure you leave enough time to work together and confirm that your counts are not duplicative. Through coordination and upon receipt of data, it should be cross-referenced to ensure there is not duplication of the count. This supports the accuracy and integrity of the data. Next slide, please. So dictionary.com says confer means to consult together, compare opinions, and carry on a discussion or deliberation. OCC, the Office of Child Care, does not have a measurable standard as to what we would consider conferring. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the action steps you could take to address overlapping service areas in your child count process. You could identify tribal communities with overlapping service areas. You could identify tribal CCDF contacts from neighboring tribal CCDF grantees, create a formal mechanism to confer with neighboring tribal CCDF grantees regarding overlapping service areas, and develop written policies and procedures to address the process for obtaining the child count and methodology from neighboring tribal grantees. Next slide, please. So here are some ideas of information that you might share with tribal lead agencies with neighboring or overlapping service areas as you confer to ensure non-duplication of your child counts. It might be a good idea to start with sharing your proposed definitions of Indian child and service area, then perhaps your data sources and your methodology approach, as well as your overall child count approach, or even your policy or procedure. Think about what other information you could share. Next slide, please. The consortia lead agency must submit a child count for each member tribe in its consortia. This includes individual child counts, definition of Indian child, definition of service area. For overlapping service areas, tribes must confer with overlapping or neighboring service areas, ensure an unduplicated count of children, and a signed demonstration or declaration letter. And this is in sample in Appendix 1 and 1A. Sample 1 is for direct funded consortia lead agencies, and sample 1 is for 102-477 consortia lead agencies. Next slide, please. All tribes who intend to receive CCDF funding, regardless of whether they currently receive CCDF funds, must submit the triennial count by July 1st of 2025. For clarification, the triennial count is a requirement for all tribes, including those who operate under a PL 102-477 consolidated plan. The Office of Child Care will review submitted child counts for completeness and compliance. If additional information is needed, Office of Child Care will contact the tribal lead agency, and each tribal lead agency will receive a response letter within 90 days of the child count submission deadline. Next slide, please. Okay, so we will leave with reflections and next step questions that you may potentially ask. So what additional information do you need in order to fill out section 1 of the plan concerning implications for families, providers, and their communities, defining Indian child and service area, conferring with tribal lead agencies with neighboring and overlapping service areas, and conducting the child count. So some additional questions to consider is what partners might you need to connect with about this section? And what questions or topics would be helpful to discuss with the Office of Child Care? Next slide, please. So lastly, I'd like to share how to connect with us. If you are not already, please do subscribe to our Office of Child Care announcements to receive all of the latest information. Also, feel free to email us at the occtribal@acf.hhs.gov if you would like to connect directly. Thank you so much for attending our session, and we look forward to talking with you all soon. Thank you.